Hello, and welcome to The People's AI, presented by Vana. I'm your host, Jeff Wilser, a journalist who covers the intersection of crypto and AI for CoinDesk and the like. And I'm thrilled today to be joined by Art Abal, co-founder of Vana, who takes us deep inside the world of decentralized data marketplaces. And we explore, with a ton of awesome nuance, how the space is evolving and what it can look like in the future. As regular listeners know, Vana's mission is to promote user-owned data to help create user-owned AI. The core principle, you own your data, but real talk, in isolation, your data is not worth much on its own. So Vana's creating a system of data DAOs to let you connect with others, join forces, sort of like a data labor union, and that gives you leverage to profit from your data and help create better AI that works better for you. But how does all of that work actually in practice? That is the topic of today's episode. We're switching from theory to reality, and we'll get into the meat and potatoes of data marketplaces, the new VRC20 token, and what this world looks like today and where it's going tomorrow. Moreover, I was struck that Art is a really thoughtful, interesting guy. He didn't come at this as a Web3 guy. He has a background in public policy and the data industry, and he realized there's a very real, very acute need for AI projects to get good data, but this should be done in a way that respects the actual owners of the data. That's you, the users. Art and I have a pretty sprawling conversation about how these data marketplaces actually work in today's world, and then we get into the weeds, the glorious weeds, of how things are kind of in the current intermediary step, and then how Art sees them in the future when it's fully frictionless and decentralized. I think anyone interested at all in how AI data systems are actually working, what are the gaps, and how do we fix those gaps, will get a lot out of this conversation. So with that, please enjoy my conversation with Art Abal, co-founder of Vana. Art, welcome to The People's AI.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's jump right into the red meats of Vana's vision for decentralized data markets. How would you describe that, and why do these matter?
So I spent a lot of time working in data marketplaces, buying and selling data for big tech. And one little known thing out there is that people's data is traded every day and for a lot of money. And it's used to make the technology that we use every day. And we're not anywhere in that equation right now. And so the vision behind Vana is basically, it's our essence that's going into the AI that's coming to us today. Like, my words are probably used to train ChatGPT. Actually, I know that my words have been used to train ChatGPT. And now I'm just an empty consumer of that. I'm just consuming the product. And I am the product. Where am I in that equation? So Vana looks at the idea that, you're creating value every day with the data that you're developing. It's not just, digital waste. It's actually very valuable. And how can you participate in a new economic system in which this data is so valuable? How can you realize upside and also drive new technology? Because with that data capital, we can not only realize financial upside, but we can actually shape what the future of technology looks like by being able to contribute our data to things that matter to us.
Just to kind of make us a little more concrete from where the world is today in the traditional centralized framework to where you guys want it to go in the decentralized fashion. Talk a little more about what these current data marketplaces look like. You were a big part of that world for years. What are some examples of a data? Give a sense of like we're talking billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, kind of like paint the picture a little more of what the landscape is like today and why it's so urgent to give agency and ownership back to users as data gets even more and more crucial in the world of AI.
Yeah, so let's take large language models like ChatGPT as an example, because I think people are quite familiar with that. There's this growing kind of body of research as to how to make it sound more human. Because if you looked at the GPT-2, any of the early ones, it sounded very robotic, and now there's some advancement into making it sound human. And you can only do so much with prompt engineering. And the reason why it doesn't sound superhuman is because it's publicly available data. Like it's marketing stuff on the internet, not necessarily the conversations that you and I are having right now or the conversations that one is having with their friend. And people want to use AI to have human-like interactions. So what do? So if you're a large tech company and you want more data, i.e. more words or more messages between actual humans, where can you get that data? If you're a large tech company who has a platform of messages between people, so, think like WhatsApp or iMessage or something like that, you have certainly some of that data, and there are restrictions on how you can use it. But you can certainly use that to train your models. That's a separate issue. But say you want more of that data. So how do you go and buy it? You go to something like my former company, Appen, and you say, hey, I'd like to buy a lot of message data. Where can you source this for me? How much is it going to cost? And so they'll price it all out. You'll go through a data collection process. You might get several data points or several rows. There's a certain price per data point, and then you get sent that data. Now, where does Appen source that data? Everywhere and anywhere that we can. So if it's like we want message data, then we'll go, find a bunch of people to give us their iMessages. And we'll work with other platforms to broker deals to get us that data and information. At the end of the day, you're either an end user who's getting paid a very, very little amount for your data if you're in one of these projects, or you're an end user who doesn't even know that your data is being sold and being contributed to one of these projects. And that's nothing, it's not anything bad about the company, it's just the structure of the industry. The structure of the industry is that this transaction goes on like a brokerage where the end users are not really part of the equation.
Maybe a silly clarifying question, but the current centralized marketplace, is that literally like a website where you can like buy and sell fluidly, or is it more like you need to call up Joe Schmuckatelli and you guys hash it out how much that is worth?
Yeah, it's an entire industry. It's almost like the consulting model. So a lot of these data providers, there's I'd say there are a lot more now than there were when I left Appen, but there's probably around 5 to 10 of them that specialize in providing this core human data for AI, and you'll find them all at similar conferences throughout the year selling product, because that's how it kind of works. Even when you think about pricing out one of these projects, it's not based on a market. It's not based on market. Sure, there's probably going to be some tendering out there. But it's really based on like a client relationship of, I've used this company before. They've given me 10,000 data points before. They'll be able to do it again. And it's a really inefficient marketplace as well. The other side that I didn't speak about was if you actually want the data and you're a developer, you'd have to have big tech money to actually access some of these data sets because they're quite expensive. One of the large tech companies had $1 billion contract with my former company to buy data. And most tech companies spend more on data than they do on ML engineers because it's just so expensive to source this kind of data.
So if you're a scrappy, young, you have a brilliant idea for how to train AI, like, cool, I'm going to start a pilot program with $500 to buy a bit of data. Any one of these data brokers would just laugh their ass off when you call them or when you see that conference.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, when I speak to my AI builder friends, and I asked this question in a community that I'm involved in Australia, of what do you do when you can't find your data set on Kaggle? Kaggle's the free open source data set place. And they say, we stop imagining, because that's all that's available. Or we go and work for big tech because that's where we can get our data. But it's a very capital intensive business right now because the markets are structured such that you need to put a lot of capital in to get that initial training data set. Unless you can aggregate it in a way that's decentralized, which
right.
is...
So great segue. So now, thank you for indulging me with kind of trying to paint a picture of what the current centralized, inefficient, illiquid marketplaces look like. Let's contrast that with your vision for kind of Vana's decentralized data marketplaces. I think listeners to this podcast by now understand in theory that Vana helps everyone understands that we all own our data. And one thing you said before that Anna has said before is that when one person's data is kind of useless, right? Just one data point. But if you band together with thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of others, suddenly, in the same way a labor union has leverage and muscle, whereas one worker does not, that data is valuable. So I get, and I think our listeners get at a high level conceptually how that works. Can you help us visualize what the actual data marketplace looks like? What is that landscape? What's that framework? What's even the interface look like for that?
Yeah, I think this is a staged process because we're in the business of creating new markets. So we're in the business of creating a new asset class, which is a data-backed asset, which is the VRC20 tokens. And then, you have to build infrastructure around that. So the starting principle is kind of what you mentioned there. You have an asset, a token that represents a data set that has been aggregated by a bunch of people. Awesome. So where does that live and how do people transact with that? Well, today, a lot of people who want to buy data are not necessarily the same people who want to buy or trade tokens. And so we've got to start at, meet people where they're at. So Vana's data access arm, actually interfaces with Web 2 companies or researchers or people who just want to access data. And they'll say something like, okay, I need this data point, I need 10,000 data points per month. How can I access it? How much is it going to cost? So we actually do a fairly manual brokerage in terms of that transaction. So
which is similar in a good way to how it's currently working in the traditional data marketplace way. And I say good because that's a process people understand.
Yes.
So you're not also saying, and please also learn to speak Portuguese at the same time, right?
Exactly.
So it's a process they get, but the crucial difference is the data that they are buying, the proceeds go directly back to the owners of the data, which is you, me, listeners of the podcast, everyone else. Am I getting that right?
Yes. So, so myself and the person who leads Vana Data, Sam, we both have experience in this data world, this data marketplace, and it's think of it like a very old business. It's very structured in that way. And it actually stems from some of the early people who collected a lot of this data were actually the consulting firms. So it is in that consulting business model. And so it's very hard to move people away from it. So when we were formulating this of like, how do we create the demand side for Vana? It's like, no, we have to really turn up to these conferences and look and smell exactly like what these people are used to in order to be able to get this to happen. And so what they will do is they'll say, hey, I have X $1,000 or I have however much money to spend on a data set. And then Vana Data, which is actually, it's carved out as its own separate entity, is able to then use that money to buy the token or to do whatever token transactions need to happen in order to get that access to that data for that individual. So it's really this true kind of intermediary that's able to broker Web 2 cash and Web3 tokens and create a data transaction.
Interesting. In a moment, I want to get to what that future, the next phase looks like. But just to kind of dwell on this a little for a moment longer, is this still in kind of the whiteboard phase, or are you guys actively have you already started selling user-owned data to AI companies that are in need of his data? And if so, what kind of data and what does that look like so far?
Yeah, there's a couple of examples that I'll share, a couple that I can't name, but one of them that I can name, which is public, is the DLP Labs transaction. So DLP Labs, their data is vehicle telemetry. So think like Tesla data, where you're driving, your battery, etc. And they're selling their data on a subscription model to an electric vehicle battery company, that they want the analytics to be able to optimize how they're building EVs and where they can deploy charging stations, et cetera, et cetera. So that transaction is that company buys the data on a subscription from the creator of the DAO. And the creator of the DAO rewards the people who've contributed the data, a lot of the demo users and a lot of the people who've contributed the users elsewise. They'll get some of that revenue through their revenue stream. So it's the alternative, actually, if I could contrast it to the Web 2 world, the alternative would have been these battery companies ring up Tesla or ring up Appen and is like, hey, can I have this data? And Tesla or Appen buys or sells that data to that company. Now we have a
user getting nothing.
User getting nothing. Yeah. Exactly. User being the product, the provider of the data.
Yes.
Now we have this really cool world in which, hey, hang on, the user is no longer just the product. The user is actually involved in that economic transaction because they're the ones creating the value at the end of the day. Tesla's just a platform. You're paying for the car. You're not paying to have your data be used for other things. And
right.
And I think that's what the beauty of this is. So that's one example. There's another example of a transaction in which I can't tell you the name, but they want monthly data on pricing. So monthly data on how much people are spending, to kind of look at what the economic health is of a particular locale. And so what they're looking at doing is, Facebook Marketplace is a very strong indicator of how much people are spending, buying and selling. And so they're currently in the process of a transaction where they'll buy access to insights from people's Facebook Marketplace data, how much they're buying and selling over time, and they'll get that, and that will be through a token burn mechanism when that data DAO is created. So it's a bit of a balancing act. It's a two-sided marketplace. We have demand for a whole range of data sets. We have data collectives that are supplying the data sets. And it's Vana Data's job to try to meet that demand or signal on both sides where demand and supply can actually balance.
That's so interesting. And can you elaborate a little more on how the token fits into the current state of play? And then we'll get to kind of what the future stage looks like. Because I get that the token is a way for individuals to immediately be compensated for their data.
Yep.
I'm fuzzier on the connection from an individual as a token, and then how that kind of like wends its way to this deal you mentioned involving DLP Labs and the batteries.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the VRC20 token standard doesn't articulate exactly how the value accrues to the token holder. We've left it open to each data DAO creator to experiment with this, but there are certain models that we've recommended and that we've seen successful. So one of them is simply to pass it through. So you can think about it as whomever holds the token will get some sort of revenue upside in that same wallet that they hold the token in. That's one approach to take. It's almost like a perpetual airdrop or something like that, where because of your holding of the token, you get something else. So that's the first model. Another model which has proven quite successful is the buy and burn mechanism. So the collective, the data collective sets up what they would like in terms of data access, so they can negotiate that. But one of the ones that's common is, hey, you need to buy X% of supply or X% of value of our token, and you need to burn it. Then the token holders naturally, through constrained supply of that token, have an upside in that token price. Probably dual upside because people then become bullish on the data sale, and so then they get pretty happy. So the reason why we left it undefined in VRC20 is because there's going to be a lot of innovation for how you pass the rewards through to the end users. Because what I'm describing is a very simplistic transaction of you have a data buyer paying data tokens, and those tokens need to somehow be going to the community. But these transactions can get quite complex. And if I could just take a moment to illustrate a couple that are complex.
Please.
The Reddit data DAO, for example, they actually were like, hey, so a Google ML engineer, a friend of ours, was like, I want access to this Reddit data DAO data set. And we're like, well, we're not in control of the DAO. You're going to need to talk to the DAO creators.
There's a free market out there. You can buy it.
Yeah, go, and we'll happily broker and kind of facilitate that transaction. And he's like, but I don't have any money. Like, I can't buy the tokens. How am I going to do it? And so that was a really cool. This was like a really cool thing for us, because then the Reddit data DAO was like, that's okay. We don't need money. You just need to be, you need to give you need to be bought into building this within the Reddit data DAO. So like the data token needs to represent the thing that you develop. And so he was like, okay, I'm just really interested in this data set. I will build you the model, give me some tokens for building the model, and I'm now part of your community. And so you start to think about this as like not just a transaction between buyer and seller, but like these collectives that can then develop their own technology because they have the core ingredients of that technology being the data and the algorithm, and then our partners who provide compute. So that's why we've kind of left it a little bit open for the VRC20 standard, because we want to see these new structures come out. Imagine if we had like collectively owned models, like that'd be awesome.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So it's almost like the data DAOs then can make a decision. Do we want to cash out and get literally cash this data, or do we take less cash? Or on a spectrum here, one end we get cash with zero input in how a data is being used and how the model is being trained. Other end of the spectrum, we get zero cash, but we are part of this. We're at the table with how the model is being developed. Perhaps we're even chiming in on governance and alignment and so on. And there's infinite variations along the spectrum of how some kind of framework could be developed. Is that kind of how you see it?
Yeah, and I mean, it would also be, I mean, the Reddit data community was bullish on the Reddit data model. So they're like, well, why would we cash out now when we could also earn money on people using or accessing that model?
To kind of close out the view of this kind of current world we're in now, before we get to like what the data marketplace will look like in the future, the VRC20 token is obviously a huge part of that. Talk a little more about kind of why you guys launched that, why a more traditional token wouldn't work, what unique properties this has, and kind of what you've learned since it's been in the wild.
Yeah, so the emergence of the VRC20 token actually was from the learnings that we encountered. We've been experimenting with the structure, but really when we launched the Vana token, we saw certain dynamics relating to data, relating to the launch of data tokens that were like, actually, a data token feels like something completely new that doesn't currently exist. It's not a meme coin because there's actual work that goes into it. There's like an underlying asset of value. And it's also not like a full project because it just represents the asset. It's more akin to kind of like an RWA token. But again,
RWD, real world data.
Yeah, but it's also a growing and changing asset class that's very fungible and has different permutations and can be used in different ways. So there's a little bit of utility. There's definitely a core asset component. And we want to invite speculation because I'll talk about the future state, but like that speculation actually moves capital in the right way for how this works. But this is so Anna and I sat down and we're like, we actually need to develop a new standard for this because this is not like any other token that exists out there in the market. It also needs to interface with Web 2. So how do we set up the minimum thresholds that allow this to exist where people who buy data and people who want to back data can feel confident that their investment is protected or that their data is going to be able to be accessed. Also, people who contribute data, how can they be sure that their data is also protected? So that's essentially what VRC20 is. It's this idea that you have to have... one of the common things that we see in Web3 is creators of tokens, pumping and dumping immediately. There are protections against that in the VRC20 standard because to do that with data, it's not just about somebody losing financial upside. It's about somebody losing their data, and that's not something that we want to sustain. Right. So we have put protections in there to make sure that the VRC20 standard can be robust to this economic system, and it's going to be continuously developed. The end goal actually of VRC20, and we're already in early discussions with certain regulatory bodies in the world about how to formalize data as an asset class so that it can be traded in traditional financial markets. We actually see VRC20 as this kind of between Web 2 and Web 3, where if you wanted to invest in Facebook without buying Facebook equity stock, you could invest in the thing that has a lot of value for Facebook, which is the Facebook data, and that can be decentrally owned.
Well, that's so interesting. If we believe, and I do, that data is a new asset class or data is a new oil, certainly the other big giant players in the world, the billion-dollar corporations, are also seeing this. They're seeing that data is super important, right?
Yep.
So what's the potential for other kind of like centralized big tech players to create their own financial infrastructure to create data as an asset class and to have liquid markets in the traditional finance world? And how do you see that kind of like, do you view this decentralized play as a competitor to that? Or is there a way if this Lego pieces all snap together? How are you seeing that landscape?
Yeah, it's interesting because if you look at the valuation of some of the largest tech companies, it's based on the data that they have.
Yeah.
It's based on this bet, which we want to bring into these data tokens, on what they can do with that data in the future. People who invest in a lot of these companies don't really know what they're going to build in the next 4 or 5 years, but their assumption is that they're so monolithic, they have so much data, they have so much technology that they're going to build something that will return profit or grow. It is certainly, it will be confronting to them that one can take a bet on the Facebook data set external from taking a bet on Facebook as an equity meta, because that then kind of, it divorces the value of the company, the value that they're actually bringing, from the value of the data that they've accrued, which is, in our philosophy, not even their data. It is our data. So I think the one thing that will constrain them from creating data as a new asset class is it runs in complete juxtaposition to their current business. So I'd actually encourage them to do it. Like Anna and I have embarked on this journey because we really believe that people's data is their own and it's so important and valuable. So if big tech wants to do this, that's my mission complete. That's awesome. Irrespective of what we're doing right now, but that's really important. The other thing that I'd say is that if one can now take a position on the data, what does that do in global financial markets? Where does capital then flow if you can take a position on the data independent of the company?
I think it flows into data, right?
Correct.
And data gains the value it truly has, and it's more it's seen nominally, not behind the scenes.
And then data and this is another thesis that Anna and I have, is that data is capital. In a future world, one might think about VCs might start to offer data as the thing that they invest in companies in, because that's the thing that steps a company up from Series A to Series B. It's the access to this particular data set or collateralized data. You start to imagine new financial products that are being built on data, and that's what we're experimenting with some thought leaders in the regulatory and finance space. It is the analogy that Anna and I always go back to is like, I wonder what people were thinking when property became ownable by individuals post-feudalism. This is kind of how we feel about data, where it's like, oh my God, this is something that I never thought I could own. Like, who invented the first mortgage? Who invented the first lease? Like, what are we going to see when we see data as a new asset class? That's the new financial system that we're hoping will emerge once we create these primitives.
Beautifully said. And that's a great segue to now let's kind of go to what that could look like more concretely. So we kind of discussed in detail, and thank you for indulging me here, of what the kind of, we first, imagine now a 3-act play. We started with kind of what the centralized data marketplaces look like when it's just, when they're kind of blind to who actually owns data. They ignore users. Act 2 is where we are right now, where it's a bit of a hybrid of user-owned data that have these Vana tokens, the VRC20 token. That is kind of like somehow it's different case by case, DAO by DAO, that kind of bumps up to the Web 2 world, where it's right now a very manual kind of boutique system where you or one of your colleagues in the Vana data team, it's cool. We will then broker a deal with someone who wants data. Paint a picture of what Act 3 looks like, of what that decentralized data marketplace looks like, that I'm guessing is a lot less friction and a lot more liquid.
Yeah. So enter what I call the data market maker, which is an interim process until people who use data will know how to use tokens and buy tokens and really be bought into that. So the data market maker is actually somebody who can earn on the spread between what somebody's willing to pay on the demand side of the data and how they position their token allocations within the data DAOs. So I'll unpack that for a moment. So say that the common mechanism for accessing data in these data collectives is through a buy and burn mechanism. And say I was somebody who is really profit seeking and I'm like, hey, like I really think that I can get people to buy the Facebook data and the Instagram data and the TikTok data. So what am I going to want to do? I want to early on buy up as much of that token as possible so that when somebody comes to me and says, hey, I pay $100,000 for TikTok, you'd be able to be like, sweet, I bought it for $10. Awesome. Give me $100,000. I'll run the operation for you. Here's your data. Here's my spread. And why I think we need to attract that kind of innovation is because it moves capital to the most efficient place. Now, that's a very extreme example, $10,000 to $100,000. But, you know, as long as you can earn spread on what you've paid or what you've bet on these tokens on and the demand that's coming in, and be able to hedge potential risk associated with that demand coming in or not, you start to be able to create really robust businesses here. And Vana Data is the first of those businesses. So it will take early positions in some tokens that it thinks it can commercialize because it knows the demand side very well. And so it can make maximum spread when somebody actually calls a function or calls that data for their AI model. Why it's shifting capital in the most efficient way is right now, the way the marketplace works, the squeeze really happens when you're trying to source the data. I'll throw this out there because it's a bit of a controversial term, but I call it data colonialism. It's the idea that I, as the buyer, know how valuable this thing is, but you as the seller don't. So I'm going to try to squeeze as much value out as possible. That's why when people say, you know, I've participated in these Web2 products, they gave me maybe like a Netflix subscription every month and nothing else. And I'm like, yes, but that doesn't reflect the value that you're actually creating in the data set or the technology that you're building. It just represents what they think you're willing to pay because you're not aware of the value because it's diffuse. And so if you have these data market makers, and that's why I use this term, come in at that early stage and say, hey, I think this is valuable. What does that do? It increases the token price, increases your potential upside, then increases the incentive to participate. And that's where we want a lot of the capital to flow because sourcing is the hardest part of the problem. And so we can start to like play with this idea of where does capital sit in the pipeline, and can we move it more towards the individual who's contributing their data? And then we can play with bonding curves and all of these other things. But like that's basically the philosophy here of like you're gonna need these intermediary shops that exist to move capital in the pipeline in the most efficient way.
So that's fascinating, and it kind of sparked a provocative question I have. If we get that liquid, do we need data DAOs? And my spicy question is, if the premise is my individual data for my Tesla is worthless. I don't own a Tesla, but theoretically, right? But banding together with 10,000 people, that's suddenly useful. But if the marketplace is liquid enough, couldn't I exchange my data for the Tesla for some token or something or other, and then whoever is just in the same way that currently, like the way that any market works, right? Bonds, stocks, whatever. Little old Jeff right here can buy one share of Apple stock tomorrow morning. That does nothing, but when there are millions of little Jeffs buying Apple stock, prices move, right? So similarly, couldn't I sell or buy my Tesla data or my Reddit data or my health biometrics data, and then if the marketplace is liquid enough, those individuals' data, people get compensated for that can all happen fluidly without the need for intermediary DAO?
hadn't even thought about that, but there's a couple of things that come to mind. And I'll just kind of word vomit and jam on this. The first thing that comes to mind is that typically data sets work in step functions, not in a linear curve. So you have you need a certain number of data points before it becomes useful.
Yeah.
I think that the existence of a collective and these bonding curves that I'm contemplating here are just to get up to that step function before
Makes
the
sense.
bonding curve graduates. So you do have that kind of minimum bar. The other thing, which is really something that people don't think about. So I was working on data sourcing. My background was actually in qualitative research and monitoring and evaluation in a policy lens. So that's fancy for saying I try to find out as much information as about people at the population level as possible. Gather as much data. That was my job, and I had to report that to corporates, to governments, and whatever. That's a really hard task.
Yeah.
And it's almost a different skill set from the financialization of data. And so what we've tried to do in our in the architecture of Vana is say we need all of those ingredients. We need the human empathy, the UX, the ability to source and have a methodology, and that needs to live at one level. And we also need the financial aspect, the trading aspect, and that needs to live at another level. How do we get them all to cooperate with each other? And that's really the protocol layer. So there is a bit of complexity to data sourcing, which may not fit with the skill set of, say, a data market maker, which is really focusing in on deploying capital efficiently and trying to make the biggest bets. However, I love that idea, actually, of a completely fungible world of data where, like, you know, I might want to buy a Coca-Cola on the street and I can just be like, here's my Facebook data. There you go.
Right. Well, that's, again, to clarify, I know nothing about data, and I'm not suggesting let's disband data DAOs.
No, that's
There's
awesome.
a million problems. But sometimes if the marketplace truly is liquid enough, I can kind of squint and imagine a world where, despite how micro and small my data looks, maybe I get some micro small, a 0.001 Vana tokens in exchange for it, right? And the invisible hand of the marketplace somehow like connects the right data to the right data buyers, no matter how granular or micro that is.
I'll introduce one more concept here, which actually really illustrates it for me. So one of my biggest challenges when I was doing sourcing at Appen was that you would have these data sets where you'd get probably like 90% of the data, but this last 10% was impossible. So a really cool example of this one is there was a data set that was people's BMI. So people had to walk into a machine and wear a nude suit. It was crazy. Spin around, and they had to get weighed and have their BMI tested. And it was to train an AI model on...
I hope they're compensated very well. That sounds like the worst.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean,
God,
I can't tell
terrible.
you the exact price, but like you would be appalled. This is why it was an issue. So it was to train an AI model to be able to take a picture of someone and predict a BMI, which is actually very transformative for people who don't have access to that, especially in like emerging markets where they don't have access to that kind of health. Really good for telehealth. It was easy to get certain categories of people, but for the AI to work, you need what we called interlocking quotas. You need demographics, race, age, and you need a full spectrum of it in order for the AI to work. So when I say we got 90% of the way, it's like we got a bunch of, 20 to 35-year-old men. We got a bunch of, 35 to 45-year-old women. But to get like a 75-year-old man to wear a nude suit, walk around and get himself weighed was a very challenging problem. And it stems from this idea that we don't have dynamic pricing of data on the sourcing side currently in the current marketplace.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that in the future, because we're putting all of this on chain, one will actually have their data priced according to how much value it adds to the data set. So this is something that I don't know if it's a little bit on the nose, but data is the one place in which diversity matters. If you're unique and not part of the standard deviation, your data is incredibly valuable. I know that for a fact. Because I had to try to source this data from people, and I was throwing money at them to try to come.
Yeah, that's incredible. Art, as we wind down, last couple of questions for you. You mentioned your background in public policy, and I love that example you just shared. How else is kind of your background? Let me talk a little bit about what you were focused on and how that kind of informs how you're thinking about this new data horizon you guys are working to build.
Yeah, I always get asked the question of like, how do you guys compare to AI scrapers? And I'm like, this is a completely different data asset.
Yeah.
Public data is different. What I'm talking about is real human data. What Vana deals with is real human data. And there are, I'd say, a good community of practitioners in the world who understand the value of like this real human data. And a lot of them come from my background of, I was doing monitoring and evaluation for the government of Timor-Leste, which is the fourth newest country in the world. I was working for the Prime Minister there, just trying to work out how the country's going. I was doing impact evaluation studies for large coffee corporations to tell them what is the impact of every dollar that they put in their supply chain on the humans around it. The question of how the world impacts humans is a data-driven question. I've got to know how much that human's life has improved, how happy they are, what they're now spending their money on. And that's when I actually, the anecdote that I always share is I was doing an impact evaluation study in Colombia, and I was struggling to get my data because I'm here like with my bad Spanish talking to a bunch of farmers saying, hey, what was your yield 6 months ago and what do you spend your money on? They're like, they look at me like I have three heads. Like can't tell you, I don't record that. And then I was at a dinner with my host mom and she's there constantly scrolling on her Facebook. And I'm like, what are you doing on your Facebook? Can I take a look? And so she really kindly showed me a Facebook and I was like, oh my goodness, like you're talking about the yield. You're talking about, you bought clothes for your daughter here. You're going to this party here. You went traveling here. I'm like, and so it made me change my methodology. I was like, maybe I should just go to each of these farmers and be like, can I look at your Facebook? And start to record data there. And then it made me think about like, okay, so if that was a more efficient data collection, what else can I get from these big tech platforms that seem to have amassed so much data? So the human side of data, Vana is at the intersection of so many things: Web 2, Web 3, user experience, technology. And I see us as also playing in this realm of in between humans and machines. And that's like what the public policy lens brings to this problem of like, how do I understand how things affect humans? Because that's essentially what you're doing in a policy environment. You're trying to understand how different interventions affect humans.
Beautiful note to end on, Art. Actually, one last question. Give us a prediction of what these, we've talked at length about kind of what these could look like, how liquid they could be. Give us a prediction for data marketplaces in the future.
I'm going to go back to my development roots and say that people talk about universal basic income all the time as some sort of thing that will happen with AI. And that assumes that humans add no value and need to be compensated at a bare level. I think that in a world in which AI does help us with the majority of tasks, it's still going to need to learn how to be human and how to interact with us. And the economies will be built not on what we do, but on who we are. And that is why data is so important. That's why human data is so important.
UDI, Universal
Basic Income. UBI.
No. I'm suggesting.
UDI, yeah.
UDI.
Yeah.
Universal data income. We're not just given allotment by our AI overlords for just living by the pool. It's saying, hey, Jeff, Art, you guys are sharing your biometrics. You're sharing your conversations. Here is your compensation for that. Go enjoy your pina colada and write your poetry on the beach.
Yeah. How do we're teaching technology to be better for us. So what's the upside to that? It's that.
I love that so much. Art, thank you so much. Really enjoyed talking to you. You've shared a lot of kind of heady ideas to all of us, and lots to kind of digest here. Really enjoyed. Thanks again, sir. Best of luck to you guys.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Loved it. Thank you.
Well, there you have it. Thank you again to Art Abal, the co-founder of Vana. As we've kind of explored in detail, all of these data marketplaces that Art and I discussed are all ultimately meant to help create user-owned AI and better AI. That's what Vana's mission is all about. And thank you to you, dear listener. If this is your first time at The People's AI, please subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, all the usual podcast places. Tell a friend, tell your friend who's into Web3. Thanks again, and see you next time.